The hotel ballroom in downtown Boston gleamed under crystal chandeliers, each prism scattering flecks of light across the crowd of political donors, corporate executives, and people who spoke in golf scores and stock prices. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and overpriced champagne. I stood near the edge of the room, back straight, scanning the guests with the quiet awareness drilled into me over a decade in uniform. Across the dance floor, my father, Gregory Carter, master of handshakes and subtle insults, was in his element. He laughed too loudly at a senator's joke, refilled his wine glass with a flourish, and basked in the glow of people whose approval he chased like oxygen. When his gaze swept across the room and landed on me, he offered a small wave that felt more like a warning than a greeting. Then, with that same casual cruelty I'd known since I was a teenager, he gestured toward me with his glass and said to the group around him, "Ignore her. Just army trash. We're still hoping she'll grow out of it." The words sliced through me, sharp, familiar, and dull all at once. I'd heard versions of them for years. But tonight, something shifted. Someone else had heard them too. Captain Ethan Wallace, the groom, stood only a few feet from my father. His smile froze mid-sentence. He set his champagne flute down with a decisive click, excused himself from his new father-in-law, a Massachusetts congressman, and crossed the floor toward my father. He didn't rush, but his posture changed instantly from a happy groom into an active duty officer. Shoulders squared, chin high, eyes locked forward. Conversations faltered as he approached, and even the string quartet's soft notes seemed to dim. "Sir," he said, voice crisp enough to cut glass. "That trash is my commanding officer." My father's expression flickered from confusion to disbelief. But I kept my stance neutral, my face unreadable. I wasn't here to make a scene. Not yet. 1 month earlier, the first fault line in this evening's drama had formed at a family dinner in Providence, Rhode Island. My father had received Ethan's wedding invitation and waved it around like a trophy. Captain Ethan Wallace, West Point graduate, marrying Congressman Bennett's daughter, he'd bragged. To him, Ethan was everything a man should be: connected, ambitious, a respectable. Then he turned to me with that same tired mix of pity and condescension. "This is the kind of man you should have been with, Claire," he said, sliding the embossed invitation toward me. "Instead of wasting your life in that little camouflage costume." What he didn't know, what he never cared to ask, was that Ethan wasn't just an acquaintance. He was one of my lieutenants. I'd been invited because he wanted his commanding officer there, out of respect, not charity. But my father's version of the story was easier. The spinster daughter dragged along to witness what she could have had if only she'd made better choices. 2 years before that, at Christmas in my parents' colonial-style house in New Haven, the gap between my two worlds had never been clearer. In one universe, I was the quiet, difficult daughter, overshadowed by my brother Andrew, the golden boy who had just been promoted to vice president at a Boston investment firm. That night, my father toasted Andrew's success, reminding everyone about the down payment they'd given him for his condo and the brand new Tesla parked in his driveway. In my other universe, one my family never saw, I was Major Claire Donovan, known in operational channels as Valkyrie. My orders carried weight. My decisions shaped missions. And while Andrew was being applauded for moving numbers on a spreadsheet, I was in a secure operations center in Fort Bragg, guiding a team out of hostile territory in Eastern Europe. On one of those nights, Ethan's voice had crackled over encrypted comms, tense but controlled. "Valkyrie, hostile patrol closing on our position. Need an alternate extraction point. Now." 90 seconds later, My call got them out alive. Here's a copy that, we owe you 1 carat more genuine respect than I'd gotten from my father in 34 years. So when my father's voice at the wedding dripped with that same old disdain, I didn't feel shame or hurt. I felt something colder. Calculating. This wasn't going to be a shouting match. I wasn't here for revenge. I was here to let my world, the one my father refused to acknowledge, speak for itself. And thanks to Captain Ethan Wallace, the moment had just arrived. The moment Ethan spoke, the ballroom seemed to freeze. My father's smirk faltered, but I didn't move. I let the silence breathe, let it settle into the air like smoke in a closed room. Ethan didn't glance at me. His eyes were fixed forward in the kind of posture that would have passed any inspection. He addressed my father by rank, non-existent, civilian, and still made it feel like a reprimand. Then, just as calmly as he'd arrived, he turned back to his bride and resumed his role as groom. My father stood there blinking, trapped between indignation and confusion. And me? I stayed still, a shadow at the edge of the party, because the real plan had started long before tonight. I'd spent years trying to translate my achievements into a language my family understood. Titles, promotions, measurable success. But they didn't speak that language. Or maybe they refused to. Either way, I'd stopped trying. When Ethan first invited me to the wedding, I'd set rules. For operational security and to avoid family theatrics, we keep our professional relationship quiet, I told him on a secure video call from Fort Liberty. His reply had been steady, but his eyes carried a spark of loyalty, crystal clear, But my respect doesn't stop when I put on a tux. That was all I needed. I didn't have to force the moment. My father's arrogance would serve as the trigger. The operation he had for steps. Step 1. Play the role they'd written for me, the awkward, underachieving daughter tagging along. Step 2. Wardrobe. I chose a simple black dress, floor length, modest neckline, paired with a thin silver bracelet. Nothing flashy. A civilian uniform that let me fade into the wallpaper. Step 3. Let my father be himself. No prompting, no bait. He'd deliver the insult without hesitation. Step 4. Trust the system. Not my family's broken hierarchy, but the military code I lived by, and the integrity of one of my best officers. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, my father was unbearable. At dinner in Cape Cod with family friends, he'd once again used me as a conversational speed bump. Claire's still doing that army thing, he'd said, rolling his eyes. We keep hoping she'll trade combat boots for high heels. My mother, Linda, had pulled me aside later in the kitchen. She was still the peacemaker, always smoothing over Greg's verbal shrapnel. You know your father just wants the best for you, as she'd murmured. A man like Captain Wallace, that's the kind of life he imagined for you. He just doesn't understand your world. And in that moment, I'd realized she was right. He didn't understand my world. And I was done trying to translate it for him. The day of the wedding arrived, brisk and bright in downtown Boston. The Beacon Grand Hotel looked like something from a film. Polished marble floors, gold trim, and the faint hum of wealth in every corner. Guests drifted between champagne tables, and a string quartet played something slow and elegant. From my spot near the back, I could see my father making his rounds, laughing with a venture capitalist here, patting a congressman's back there. Every so often, he'd glance at me like I was a child left in the wrong room. It didn't bother me. Not today. I'd seen this play before and already knew the ending. When he finally delivered their military trash a line, I didn't flinch. I'd been ready for weeks. But what I hadn't planned, what I couldn't have scripted better, was Ethan hearing it and choosing to act. His approach across the ballroom was pure theatre, but unintentional. People stopped talking as he passed. Even the waitstaff seemed to sense something important was about to happen. And when he dropped the line, "That trash is my commanding officer," it wasn't just a defense. It was a verdict. My father didn't understand the weight of what had just been said. Not yet. But the others in the room, the ones who knew what a commanding officer meant, were already shifting their gaze from him to me. I didn't need to add anything. Silence was the most powerful weapon in my arsenal tonight. My father's world ran on charm and noise. Mine ran on precision and consequence. And now, for the first time in my life, those worlds were colliding in public. I watched him take a slow sip of his wine, trying to recover, his cheeks flushed with the effort of pretending nothing had happened. But the seed had been planted, and the rest of the night would water it. The real impact was still to come, and I wouldn't have to lift a finger. For a few suspended seconds the ballroom floated in silence, a snow globe of held breath and cooling champagne. Then conversations resumed in small, nervous ripples, people whispering, I sliding from my father to me and back again, recalibrating the pecking order in real time. I stayed at the perimeter, hands loosely clasped, the same posture I use when a briefing is about to pivot from theory to execution. Congressman Bennett, now Ethan's father-in-law, noticed the disturbance and came over with the careful gait of a man who understands optics. The congressman was shorter than he looked on television, but carried the practiced calm of the well-filmed. His wife, elegant in navy silk, trailed a half step behind. Ethan intercepted them, spoke quietly, and then executed a crisp quarter-turn toward me. The congressman followed his line of sight. Major Donovan, he said, voice pitched to reach the immediate circle without turning the room into a stage. He extended his hand. I've heard your call sign in hearings. Valkyrie, isn't it? You've guided some tough teams home. The name skimmed the chandeliers and came down like a verdict. A few guests didn't register it, a few did and straightened instinctively. My father heard only the tone, the respect threaded into the syllables. Respect he'd chased all evening and suddenly could not command. Yes, sir, I replied. We had good people on the ground. The congressman's eyes warmed. Good people still need excellent command. He squeezed my hand with measured pressure, then stepped aside so his wife could greet me, too. That simple choreography, those microsignals of deference, rearranged the room. The tech CEO who'd been shoulder-to-shoulder with my father a minute earlier now found compelling interest in a floral arrangement across the aisle. Ethan took one formal step toward me and inclined his head. Not loud. Not performative. Just enough. Protocol threaded through velvet. My father, Gregory, attempted a social recovery. Claire's always liked her little government job, he said, chuckling, aiming for affable, landing somewhere near brittle. We're very proud of. Dad, I said evenly, and the single word was a bridge lowered and raised in the same breath. Maybe let's not do this one. He blinked. Around us, the oxygen changed temperature. The congressman, to his credit, cut the tension without erasing it. Major, I read a brief about a rerouted extraction last year, he said. Eastern Europe. ISR ret ask, 90-second window. Your signature? I nodded once. Shared effort. Captain Wallace executed under pressure. Ethan's jaw set, humbled and fierce at the same time. My father's eyes darted between us, trying to stitch a new narrative with old thread. It wouldn't hold. 2 winters earlier, in a windowless SCIF at Fort Bragg, the air had the metallic bite of recycled cold. 3 feeds painted disparate truths across a dozen screens: SIGINT, drone ISR, and a human source dropping coordinates like stepping stones across a black river. Ethan's team had been 3 turns deep in a maze that changed walls without warning. Valkyrie, patrol on our 6, Ethan had said over encrypted comms, breathing steady, vowels clipped. Original exfil compromised. On my console, a thermal smear shifted behind a ridge line like a thought you couldn't quite catch. I rolled my chair 2 inches, toggled a different sensor, shaved a minute off options that didn't matter. 90 seconds is a lifetime and a heartbeat. Archangel 1, EI said, voice flat by design, ret asking ISR to grid Delta 4. New exfil marker Sierra 9. Window 90 seconds. Do not hesitate. A beat. Then, a copy, Valkyrie. Moving. There's a flavor of silence that tastes like calculation. It filled the SCIF until a green dot crossed the last dangerous threshold and a dozen shoulders exhaled at once. No cheers. Just a pencil set down and a coffee that suddenly had temperature again. Solid copy, Ethan had said. Calm, grateful. We owe you one. My father would have called it luck. The teams called it leadership. The record called it a recommendation with 2 signatures in dark blue ink. Back in Boston, the quartet shifted from Debussy to something brighter. The room resumed its choreography, serving trays gliding, camera flashes flicking like small, polite lightning. But a new vector had taken hold. People who had laughed at my father's jokes drifted, not rudely, just inevitably, like water seeking a lower shore. A woman in a silver dress approached, introduced herself as the COO of a defense tech startup. Major Donovan, she said, a hint of wonder smoothing the edges of her voice. I read the hearing transcript on your logistics reforms. You cut hours, not corners. She tilted her head. I'd love to talk about what underload, truth matters means in your world. Happy to, I said. She smiled, thanked me, and retreated, aware this was not the time to poach. My father watched the exchange, puzzlement deepening into something that looked, finally, faintly, like doubt. My mother, Linder, surfaced at his elbow, the faithful editor of his public sentences. Greg, she murmured, and maybe we should congratulate Claire properly. She reached for my hand, squeezed, her smile tremulous but genuine. I squeezed back. Some bridges you don't burn, you light them enough to see your footing. Near the dais, the photographer lifted a lens. Major, could we get one with the wedding party? He asked, glancing to Ethan for permission he didn't need but wanted to show. Ethan waved him over. The bride, poised, kind, offered me a quick, warm hug. Thank you for bringing him home, as she whispered. I nodded, because some acknowledgements don't require a reply. We arranged ourselves in a clean row. In the split second before the shutter dropped, Ethan settled into parade rest, and 2 groomsmen unconsciously mirrored him. It made the photo look balanced and made my father look out of step without anyone meaning to. Flash. After the formalities, I slipped to a quieter corridor off the ballroom, where an antique mirror reflected back a woman who fit neither my father's label nor his imagination. I straightened the bracelet on my wrist, the one my team had given me after that Eastern Europe night, plain silver, inside engraving simple, E underload, truth. The words steadied my breath like a metronome. Shoes clicked behind me. My father. Claire, he said, voice rough with too much vintage and too little water. I didn't realize. I know, I said softly. It wasn't a weapon. It was just accurate. He tried for a joke, failed, tried for dignity, almost found it. You could have told us. I did, I said, meeting his eyes. Just not in the language you respect. He absorbed that like a man reading an unexpected bill. That boy, Wallace, he shouldn't have embarrassed you. Or me. The admission was crooked, but it stood. He followed protocol, I said. You threw the first punch. For a heartbeat, he looked like the father who had once taught me to ride a bike along Edgewood Park in New Haven, one steady hand at my back, letting go only when he trusted I could find balance. Maybe we had both been wrong about when he'd let go, and what road I'd chosen afterward. I'm proud you're respected, he managed, the phrase assembled like furniture without instructions. I just thought, he ran out of map. I know what you thought, I said, gentler now. Tonight isn't about you and me. It's Ethan's day. He nodded, grateful for the exit I handed him. Right. Of course. He straightened his tie. We should get back. We walked in silence the last few steps. At the threshold, he paused, then did something I did not expect. He stepped aside and let me into first. A small thing. But small things, aligned, move heavy loads. Inside, the music lifted and the crowd shifted again. This time opening a path I did not ask for and did not refuse. I wasn't the center of anything. I was simply visible. The rest of the night would be quiet. Handshakes that meant something, conversations that didn't need my father as translator, and a new, precise gravity settling into the space between us. I didn't need an apology to proceed. I needed accuracy. And accuracy, at last, was in the room. The remainder of the wedding reception moved with a kind of strange calm, the kind you feel after a summer storm when the air is heavy but still. Conversations didn't flow the same way. They bent, redirected, found new orbits. And for once, I wasn't the satellite spinning quietly on the outside. People who had barely glanced at me before now came with deliberate steps, their eyes holding an unfamiliar weight, respect without pity. A state senator I'd met once at a defense appropriations meeting in D.C. clasped my hand and said, "A Major Donovan, Valkyrie, I've read your after-action reports. The way you cut those exfil windows? That's art under fire." His wife nodded as though she'd just been introduced to a war hero. Which, technically, she had. The tech CEO who'd been swapping jokes with my father an hour earlier asked me about leadership under pressure, in that earnest, fishing for wisdom tone executives use when they've realized someone else knows more about stakes than quarterly revenue. My father and mother became ghosts. No argument. No dramatic exit. They just began moving less, talking less, shrinking at the edges of the celebration until they slipped out through a side door without a word. The image was almost cinematic, two sharply dressed figures evaporating from a room that no longer revolved around them. I stayed until after the cake was cut, speaking when spoken to, answering politely, but never over-explaining. Years in uniform had taught me that presence is as much about restraint as it is about action. When I finally left, I walked out into the cold Boston night with the same steady pace I'd kept all evening, but inside something fundamental had shifted. A year later, the air was nothing like Boston's winter. Heat shimmered above the tarmac at Fort Liberty's airfield, the kind of North Carolina summer heat that sticks to your uniform. I stood at a podium, oak leaf cluster now on my shoulders, Lieutenant Colonel Claire Donovan, and looked out over my formation. My people. Captain Ethan Wallace stood in the front row, back straight, jaw set, the kind of posture that wasn't for me, but for the moment. I spoke about his leadership on that impossible mission, about the lives that had come home because he trusted the chain of command. Then I pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on his uniform, the medal catching sunlight in a way no ballroom chandelier could replicate. Here, there were no donors, no senators, no fathers to impress. Just soldiers who knew exactly what it meant to earn your place. When I returned to my office overlooking the airfield, I found an email waiting. Sender, Gregory Carter. Subject line, Claire. The message was short. I spoke with Congressman Bennett last week. He holds you in the highest regard. It seems I have been misinformed about the nature of your service. I would like to understand. There was no "I'm sorry." No acknowledgement of the years he'd spent treating my career like a family embarrassment. Only the validation of a powerful man's opinion, wrapped up as curiosity. I read it twice, then let my gaze drift to the framed photo on my desk, not of family, but of my unit, dust-covered and grinning after a brutal deployment. My real family. The ledger I'd kept in my head for decades, tallying every slight, every dismissal, felt suddenly closed. His approval wasn't currency I traded in anymore. I typed a polite, non-committal reply, "Glad you're taking an interest. We can talk sometime." Then I archived the message, pulled a classified operations folder toward me, and focused on the next mission. My father had always believed respect was won in banquet halls, over clinking glasses and political favors. I knew better. True respect is quiet, often earned in places no one else will ever see, until one day. Without you asking, it's recognized in public. And when that happens, you don't need to prove anything anymore. You just keep doing the work. 3 weeks after Ethan's award ceremony, I found myself driving down I-95 toward New Haven. Not for family reasons, at least, not in the way my parents would have understood, but because one of my former soldiers had opened a veteran-owned mechanic shop there, and he'd invited me to the ribbon cutting. It was the kind of event my father would have skipped without a second thought. Too small. Too local. But for me, it was exactly the kind of place I wanted to be. No media, no VIP seating, just people who'd carried each other through fire and back. As I parked, I spotted a familiar figure leaning against the corner of the building. Gregory Carter, in a pressed blazer that looked slightly too warm for the summer air. He'd called twice since that email, each time catching my voicemail. I'd never called back. "Claire," he said, straightening as I approached. "You didn't tell me you'd be in town." "I didn't think it was relevant," I replied, shaking the shop owner's hand before turning back to him. He gave a short, awkward nod toward the mechanic bay. "One of yours?" "Yes," I said simply. For a long moment, we just stood there. He seemed to be searching for a line of conversation that wouldn't collapse under its own weight. Finally, he went with the safest option. "Your mother's been asking about you." "I know," EI said. We've talked. There was an edge of surprise in his eyes at that. He hadn't realized Mom and I had re-established contact. Probably because she didn't report my every move to him anymore. Inside, the air smelled faintly of motor oil and fresh paint. The ribbon was cut, hands were shaken, photos were taken with cell phones, not press lenses. At one point, my father drifted inside and lingered at the edge of the group. He didn't interrupt, didn't insert himself. He just watched. When I was leaving, he stepped forward. You've built something, he said. I've built a lot of things, I answered. His mouth twitched, maybe toward a smile, maybe toward another lecture. But instead, he just said, it matters. More than I understood. It wasn't an apology. But it wasn't nothing. A week later, I was back at Fort Liberty, knee-deep in planning sessions for Operation Sentinel Arc. A multi-unit deployment, joint task force, high-risk extraction. Exactly the kind of work that sharpened my focus and silenced the rest of the world. In the Secure Operations Center, time was measured not in hours but in shifts, in decisions that could save or cost lives. There was no room for family politics here, no space for doubting whether I belonged. One night, as we mapped contingencies for a possible hostage recovery, Captain Wallace leaned over my console and said quietly, You've been different since the wedding. Not softer, just quieter inside. I considered that. That's what happens when you stop translating yourself for the wrong audience, I said. He grinned faintly. Makes the orders easier to follow. When Sentinel Arc launched, it went almost too smoothly. A clean insertion, the primary targets located faster than projected, an extraction under the cover of a weather front that had looked like trouble on paper but became the perfect shield in reality. Back at base, as we conducted the after-action review, my XO noted, we've just set a new benchmark for mission efficiency. I nodded, but didn't tell him the truth, that my mind had been clearer, my decision sharper, because I wasn't carrying the background noise of trying to prove myself to people who'd already decided not to see me. A month later, a small package arrived at my office. No return address, just my name written in my father's distinct, angular handwriting. Inside was a photograph, me in the ballroom in Boston, captured just after Ethan's public declaration, my face calm, my posture steady. No note, no explanation. I placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk. Not on the wall. Not in a frame. Some things you acknowledge without putting on display. That fall, I was invited to speak at a leadership symposium at Georgetown University. The panel was stacked with corporate CEOs, political advisors, and one Navy admiral whose reputation preceded him by decades. During the Q&A, a student asked, how do you earn respect in environments where people have already decided you don't belong? I paused before answering, thinking of decades of dinner tables, backhanded compliments, and conversations I'd left with my hands clenched under the surface. You stop auditioning for the wrong panel, I said finally. You find the environments where results speak louder than resumes. And then you do the work until even the people who doubted you can't ignore what you've built. The Admiral chuckled and leaned into his MIC, that's doctrine right there. That night, back in my hotel room, I thought about how far I'd come since Boston. The ledger was gone. The noise was gone. And in its place was a clean, uncluttered horizon, one I was finally steering toward without checking if my father was watching. 2 months after the Georgetown Symposium, I was in the command suite at Fort Liberty when the secure line lit up in red. The kind of call you don't ignore, even if it means missing a meal, sleep, or a promotion ceremony. The brief was crisp, stripped of theatrics. A humanitarian convoy in a politically unstable border zone had gone dark. Satellite imagery showed smoke near the last known location, and intelligence suggested a local militia was moving toward the area. If the convoy was still intact, the window to reach it would close within hours. By 4 o'clock, Operation Wintergate was live. Joint Army or Air Force insertion, small footprint, speed prioritized over everything else. I was commanding from the ops floor, my voice threaded into the ears of every squad lead. The air smelled like burnt coffee and static, the way it always does before we push. At 6:12, a drone feed court heat signatures moving toward the convoy. Too many to count without zoom, all armed. Our lead ground unit reported visual on the trucks, 3 still mobile, 1 disabled, civilians huddled inside. I ordered an immediate diversionary maneuver to pull the militia toward our flanking team. Captain Wallace's voice came through, steady even under gunfire. "A Valkyrie, primary convoy clear to move. Requesting air cover for route Delta." "Copy, Archangel 1, EI replied. "Close escort inbound, 2 minutes. Keep moving, window is shrinking." For the next 40 minutes, the ops floor moved in choreographed urgency. ISR operators feeding updates, JTACs vectoring close air support, ground units executing with the kind of precision you can't fake. At 6:53, the last convoy truck crossed the border into friendly territory. No casualties. Not one. By 10 o'clock, the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office had issued a brief statement to the press. U.S. forces successfully executed a humanitarian extraction in region name redacted, safeguarding over 40 civilians from imminent danger. My name wasn't in the release, but my role was clear to anyone who knew where to look. Which is why, by lunchtime, my phone was buzzing with messages from colleagues, from old academy classmates, and, inevitably, from my mother. "Mom, we just saw something on the news. Were you there? Were you in charge? Your father wants to know." I didn't answer right away. Not because I was avoiding her, but because I'd promised myself no more rearranging my day to satisfy their curiosity. By evening, when I finally called, she answered on the first ring. "Claire." We were watching the footage, the trucks, the helicopters, and Gregory said, "That's her." Was it? Yes, EI said. My team handled it. I heard my father's voice faintly in the background. Handled it, he wasn't dramatic enough for him. He wanted medals, headlines, maybe a line about how I'd saved the day. But the truth was, I wasn't interested in their applause anymore. "You didn't tell us," and my mother said, almost accusing. "You found out," EI replied evenly. "That's enough." 2 days later, a regional news outlet ran a deeper story. They'd spoken with aid workers from the convoy, people who, between tears, described a calm female voice on the radio guiding them through chaos. They didn't know my name, but they knew the call sign. That was how my father, Gregory Carter, finally heard a Valkyrie outside the ballroom in Boston. Not from a groom defending his commanding officer, but from strangers who owed their lives to her. That weekend, I drove up to New Haven to drop off some documents for a friend's nonprofit. My plan was in and out, no family stops. But as I was walking back to my car, my father appeared on the sidewalk, hands in his coat pockets. "I read the article," he said. I nodded. "They called you Carm." Under fire. That's the job, I said. He studied my face for a moment. You really don't need us to know, do you? I met his eyes. Not anymore. There was no anger in my voice, just fact. He looked like he might say something else, but instead, he stepped back, giving me the space to parse. That night, in my apartment, I poured a glass of water, sat on the couch, and thought about how different it felt now. A few years ago, I would have been vibrating with the need to prove myself, to make them understand the scope of what I did. Now, I was content letting the truth find them without my hand on the delivery. 2 weeks later, a formal commendation packet for Wintergate arrived from the Department of the Army. It would go into my official file, and eventually into a locked cabinet. The work was done. The civilians were safe. The rest, the news, the recognition, was just noise. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 2 months after Operation Wintergate, when my secure phone rang. I was in the middle of reviewing a logistics forecast for an upcoming deployment when the extension lights started blinking. The number wasn't military, it was civilian. And not just any civilian. It was my mother. I stepped into the hallway to answer. Claire, she said without her usual preamble. Your father's in the hospital. The pause after her words was deliberate, like she was gauging whether I'd ask for details or just say I was coming. I asked. A mild heart attack, she said. He's stable, but they're keeping him for observation. He keeps asking for you. By that evening, I was standing in the cardiac ward of Yale New Haven Hospital, dressed in civilian clothes that still somehow carried a military neatness. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner. I found his room. Gregory Carter lay propped up against white pillows, wearing a hospital gown but somehow still managing to look like he was hosting a meeting. He smiled faintly when he saw me. Lieutenant Colonel, he said. His voice was weaker than I'd ever heard it. Dad, I replied, taking the chair beside his bed. For a while, we didn't talk about the hospital or his health. Instead, he asked about my unit, the training cycle, whether Captain Wallace was still that sharp young man from the wedding. I realized he was choosing my world over his usual conversational terrain, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a performance. Eventually, he glanced toward the door to make sure we were alone. I was wrong, he said quietly. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Years in the field had taught me the value of waiting someone out. I thought your work was temporary, he continued. A phase. Something you'd grow out of. I didn't understand that it's your life's work. That it's important. He cleared his throat. And I was afraid that I'd lose you to it. It was strange hearing fear from a man whose currency had always been control. But I knew exactly what he meant. The danger in my line of work isn't abstract. It's a weight you feel every time you pack a rucksack or send someone else out into harm's way. You did lose me, I said finally. Not to the army. To your refusal to see me as I am. He winced, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. The next morning, I came back to find him sitting up, reading a copy of the New Haven Register. The front page carried a small piece about the VA expanding resources for female veterans. He tapped the article with one finger. They should have you speak at one of these events, he said. You'd be good at it. Maybe, I replied, though public speaking about my service wasn't something I sought out. Still, the fact that he could imagine me as the subject of an article instead of a footnote in someone else's story, that was new. When he was discharged, I offered to drive him home. The ride was quiet until we crossed the Quinnipiac River Bridge. That's when he said, "I don't think I'll ever understand everything you do. But I believe in it. And I'm glad other people see it, too." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get. And maybe, for the first time, I didn't need more than that. Back at my own place that evening, I set my keys on the counter and pulled out a slim folder from my desk drawer, orders for a joint training exercise overseas. I'd be gone in less than 3 weeks. Normally, I wouldn't have mentioned it to my parents. But now, I sent a short message to my mother. "Leaving for training soon. Won't be reachable for a bit. Tell Dad I'll see him when I'm back." The reply came minutes later. He says, "Be safe, Valkyrie." I stared at the words for a long time. It wasn't approval. It wasn't possession. It was respect, sent without fanfare, wrapped in the call sign he once heard as an insult in a Boston ballroom. The transport flight to Ramstein Air Base hummed with the steady vibration that always felt to me like the sound of shifting gears, one world sliding into another. We were a small team, forward deploying for a joint NATO exercise in the Bavarian Alps, the kind designed to stress test both equipment and command decisions under layered pressure. On paper, it was all simulation. In practice, the terrain, the weather, and the stakes had a way of turning a training into something much closer to reality. 3 days in, the exercise was already proving itself a study in controlled chaos. My unit was paired with a Polish reconnaissance squad and a German logistics team, tasked with moving a high-value asset through a narrow valley under simulated enemy pressure. A storm front had rolled in overnight, dumping sleet that turned the slopes into glass. The original plan called for us to move along the eastern ridge, safer footing, better comms, but slower. As we approached the junction point, my recon lead fed me updated weather data. Winds on the ridge were gusting at speeds that would ground our drone overwatch. Without aerial eyes, we'd be blind to any flanking maneuvers. The alternative was a descent into the valley floor, a direct route that shaved an hour off our timeline but placed us in a natural choke point. In real-world terms, that kind of exposure could mean ambush. In exercise terms, it could mean a kill that would pull us out of the scenario entirely. I stood over the map table in the mobile command post, the Polish captain waiting for my call, his pen poised over the route sheet. My XO leaned in and whispered, "The ridge is the safe bet. If we lose the drone feed, we adjust. No one will fault you for sticking to plan." Safe bet. Stick to plan. The words had weight, familiar, almost familial. My father's voice in a different tone, "This is the kind of man you should have been with, instead of wasting your life in that little costume." The safer path had always been the one that looked better to other people, even if it wasn't built for the terrain ahead. I tapped the map at the valley route. "We go low," EI said. "Double scouts ahead, stagger the asset movement, use the storm for cover." If this were live, we'd never choose a blind ridge without air. The Polish captain grinned. "Fast and invisible. I like it." We moved. Halfway through the valley, the exercise enemy, role players in camo, sprang their ambush. Only they were where we'd wanted them to be, focused on our lead Dicker unit, thinking they'd caught the prize. The real convoy slipped past, masked by weather and terrain, and crossed the final checkpoint 20 minutes ahead of schedule. When the after-action review wrapped, the NATO exercise director pulled me aside. "That call you made, valley over ridge, it's not the obvious choice," he said. "Most leaders here would have played it safe. You trusted the conditions, and it paid off." I gave the standard deflection, a right team, right timing, but inside, I felt the echo of Boston. The ballroom. My father's eyes when he realized the rules were different in my world. That night, in the mess tent, I checked my phone. A message from my mother. "Your father's been asking where you are. I told him you're in Germany for training. He said, is she always did like the mountains." It was such an odd, simple line that I read it twice. Not approval. Not condescension. Just a statement of fact about who I was, minus the judgment. I typed back, "Tell him they're better when you move through the valleys." She sent a single thumbs up emoji. When the exercise ended, we boarded the transport back to Ramstein. My XO sat beside me, flipping through the final reports. "You know," he said, "most commanders wouldn't have risked the valley route. But I've been under your command long enough to know you don't make moves to please an audience." I smiled slightly. That's the job. And the life. Back in North Carolina a week later, I walked into my office to find a padded envelope on my desk. No sender listed. Inside was a slim paperback, an old, weathered copy of The Art of War. The first page had a handwritten note in my father's blocky script. "In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity. Thought you'd appreciate this one, Claire." I did. Thanksgiving that year was the first time in nearly a decade I agreed to attend a full Carter family gathering. The invitations had always been sent, engraved cards from my mother, follow-up phone calls from an aunt or two, but I'd always found a mission, a training rotation, or frankly, a better reason not to be in the room. This time, I said yes. Not because I needed anything from them, but because I finally didn't. Their home in New Haven looked exactly as it always had: brick front, wreath on the door, driveway packed with polished sedans. Inside, the air was thick with cinnamon, sage, and the polite chatter of people circling the same conversational scripts they'd been using since the Bush administration. I walked in wearing a navy sweater and jeans, my hair pulled back, my posture relaxed. I wasn't here to perform or to blend. Just to be. My mother appeared first, her hands warm around mine. "You made it," she said with a kind of smile that hinted she hadn't been sure until she saw me in the doorway. "Wouldn't miss it," I said. And for once, it was true. My father was in the den, talking to my brother Andrew about some investment opportunity. He looked up as I entered. There was no hesitation, no attempt at a joke. He stood, extended his hand, not in the formal grip of a handshake, but in a straightforward, human gesture. "Claire," he said. "Good to see you home." "Good to be here," I replied. And I meant that, too. We didn't dwell. We didn't rehash. We just moved into the dining room, where the table gleamed under soft light, every place set with the family's best china. Dinner unfolded like any other holiday meal, debates about football teams, my uncle's annual story about the turkey fryer incident, kids chasing each other through the hallway. But there was something different in the air when people spoke to me. The usual half-interested nods about your army thing were gone. Instead, my cousin asked about my last deployment, and Andrew's teenage daughter wanted to know if I'd ever jumped out of a plane. When I answered, they listened. Not with the performative politeness I'd grown up around, but with genuine curiosity. Midway through dessert, my father tapped his glass. In the past, this was the cue for a toast, usually about Andrew's career or some new real estate acquisition. This time, he looked at me. "I'm grateful this year," he began, "for a family that keeps showing me new ways to understand pride. And for my daughter, who's taught me more about leadership, perseverance, and courage than I thought I had left to learn." The table was quiet for a beat, and then the usual clinking of forks resumed. No applause, no theatrics. Just a statement, offered without angle. I raised my coffee cup toward him. "Thanks, Dad." Later, as people gathered their coats and leftovers, he found me in the kitchen. "You probably don't need to hear this," he said, "but I'm glad you came. It felt different, having you here this year." It was different, I agreed. Because I'm not here looking for anything. I'm just here. He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Maybe, finally, it did. When I left, the night air was cold and clean. I walked to my car with the easy stride of someone carrying only what she chose to bring. There was no lingering tension in my shoulders, no rehearsed lines in my head for the next time we spoke. On the drive back, I thought about the missions that had defined my career, the ones where precision mattered more than power, where patience was the real weapon. This had been one of those. A long operation with no single decisive strike, just a slow, deliberate shaping of the field until the outcome was inevitable. Back in my apartment, I placed my keys on the counter and glanced at the framed photo on my desk, the one of my team, faces streaked with dust, grinning after a mission that could have gone either way. They were my family, always. But maybe now, I could have space for the other one too. The phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Your father says he's making room on the mantel for a certain medal. He didn't say which one. I think he knows they're not his to display, but he'd like to see it anyway." I smiled, set the phone down, and poured a glass of water. Some victories are loud. Others are just the quiet acknowledgement that the ground has shifted, and you can stand on it without bracing for impact.